right, hello and welcome to our newest series on the Awaken Podcast. And in this series, we're going to be kind of going over the movement as a whole, the Messianic movement as a whole, and like what may need to be improved on and what it has right. Because I mean, like, it's easy to be critical of the movement, especially if you're in it. And I don't think there's a good way to kind of move forward with the movement unless we start becoming more critical. But we do have the movement does definitely have some stuff right, but we are joined today by a very special guest, another John Brown. If you want to tell the guests a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. Um, so I am Jonathan Brown. I guess at this point, or at least today, I'll be the other Jonathan Brown. So as far as Messianic movement goes, I mean, I've seen a lot of different sides of it. Now, I grew up in it. My mother was raised Sabbath keeping, feast keeping, kosher food eating, which tends to be kind of the core of everything. You kind of break down what makes somebody Torah observant in those three categories. Do you keep Sabbath, keep feast, you keep food laws? That kind of groups everybody into essentially this little pro-law basket. When my mom was a child, and even before she was born, her parents had joined, at the time, was one of the only available churches, was Worldwide Church of God. So that's where they got their start with learning about the Sabbath and the feasts and food laws. The problem with Worldwide, and there were many, kind of overall, was just that was about where it stopped. So anything outside of, well, yes, we keep the Sabbath, and yes, we don't eat unclean things. Really, anything beyond that was, we don't get too Jewish. That was the view of it. It was still very much a traditional, sort of fundamentalist Christian organization. They were also very focused on end times prophecy. They were very focused on, we are the last days church, and Herbert Armstrong is the prophet, that sort of thing. So there was an obvious amount of baggage that came with that. But like I said, that's how my mom was raised. Me, I was raised very much in a lot of that as well. When I was probably nearing teen years, is when a lot more stuff started coming out. So I'm getting into the early 2000s. Date myself a little bit. Getting into the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, there's a lot more of an interest in Hebrew roots, Jewish roots, going back to the roots of the Christian faith. And there really had been even for years prior to that, but it's really through internet access that everything started proliferating so much. You started to find out, hey, there's actually a lot of other people out here who believe in keeping the Sabbath even though you're not Jewish, and who believe in not eating pork even though you're not Jewish. And I'm not the only one. I must not be crazy. That was kind of the things you begin to encounter. And at that time, my parents had gotten some material from First Fruits of Zion, which is a Messianic Jewish organization. We were getting some Torah Club stuff, learning more Hebrew terminology, learning more, Jewish tradition. And I think kind of the only negative, at least at that time, was the two often melded together. So it was sometimes hard to differentiate between, okay, which piece of this is, yes, we find this in the Hebrew Bible, and which piece of this is not found there, but it came about 1,500 years later as a tradition and that sort of thing. A lot of that water got kind of muddied. So I get into my teen years. I started frequenting a Messianic synagogue in Memphis, Tennessee. Spent a couple of years there. And it was about that time, about age 16, 17 or so, that I started to get an interest in making my faith mine. So not just the faith of my parents, not just what I was told to believe, not just, well, we keep Sabbath because we do. But why do I believe this? Why is this something that I'm going to continue to practice? And that continued, like I said, about age 16, 17, continued on for however long. Doing my own studies, which albeit are limited when you think you already know everything. But doing my own studies, I reached pretty much all the same conclusions. It was, yes, we keep Sabbath because we should be. We don't eat these unclean things because we shouldn't be. So most of that. So I continued on, like I said, mostly just personal study into my early to mid 20s. Around 2013, 2014, I started. Originally, it was just a little WordPress blog, and I just had it on my heart to write. And it was like, you know what? There's a lot of stuff. I had a lot of friends that I'm friends with on Facebook, a lot of guys that I grew up with, went to youth group with. Because despite growing up, in a Torah Observant household, I still attended the youth group with all my friends from my homeschool group. That was a local, mostly Baptist. They say non-denominational, but to me, non-denominational just means your pastor's divorced. But either way, they said it was non-denominational church. Mostly Baptist. A lot of the very, very common talking points. Your altar call, you get rededicated and kind of resaved every Sunday and Wednesday evening. That sort of thing. But I had a lot of friends that, as we got older, some of them had expressed interest in theological matters as well. And so I started this WordPress blog to just kind of address these things that they knew made me weird, right? Like Sabbath made me weird. Telling people that, oh no, I guess I can't, have this job, or getting turned down for jobs because I say I don't work on Sabbath. That was weird, especially when you're 18, 19, 20, and it's like, hey, make all the money you can. Going to a friend's house and being like, it's okay, I'll buy my own pizza because I don't eat pepperoni. That was weird.
Right.
Feasts, this sit outside in a tent and you wave a fruit and a branch around. That's weird. I mean, let's be honest, right? I mean, the branches at Sukkot, that is weird. But yeah, that's how I looked. And so I wanted to give not just an explanation of me as an adolescent saying, oh, well, I do it because, or even kind of the generic, because when I was a kid, my common response was, God said so. Why don't you eat pork? Well, God said not to. What? Because, again, other kids don't know either.
Yeah, they don't know.
So I put together this blog, and originally without very much theological understanding, but thinking I knew. I had collected to Yahweh, which is kind of an amalgamation of Greek and Hebrew together, essentially meaning the elect or the chosen of God. Not calling myself the chosen one or anything, but more about, because eklektos is the word used in Greek referring to God's chosen people, right? God's elect people. So I named the blog that, and I wrote things to really address what most of the kind of misconceptions were about food law. So what is food? The biblical definition of food never actually includes anything that's unclean. Most people don't think about that. Most people haven't heard that. So when they say, oh, well, it's unclean food versus clean food, and well, he declared all foods unclean, Mark 7, Matthew 15, that whole thing. So I had to address that, at least I felt I had to address it. The Sabbath, why do we keep the Sabbath? It's a perpetual sign forever. There's no reason not to. There's no scripture telling you not to. There's nothing that says it changed. Really just things like that, kind of those hot button issues, those introductory issues. And eventually I decided I wanted to do more with the website than just post blogs. So I migrated over to Weebly. And it's been on Weebly for a while. When I first moved it, I had called it Bechira, because Bechira is essentially the Hebrew term for chosen. And that more along the lines because that was when I first really engaged in the free will debate. So I was like, yes, you have freedom to choose, Bechira Chofshit, as the Jews would say. So freedom to choose, that's what I'm going to name my website now. That name didn't last long, mostly because people were like, I don't know how to spell that. So it was after that I kind of rebranded it again as Torah Apologetics. And so that's what the site is today, is TorahApologetics.com. It kind of focuses on 3 different major areas. So one is, of course, apologetics. We'd hope so. It's in the name. But less so typical Christian apologetics. Normally when you think of apologetics, you think of arguing with atheists, right? You think of defending the faith against Islam or against Hinduism or some outside challenge to the faith. But for me, the apologetics bit was just as much defending the Messianic, Torah Observant, Hebraic, whatever branding you choose, defending this faith from outside challenge, whether that is from the normative Christian church, such as on Sabbath and feasts and food laws, and really the continuation of the law past the resurrection, as well as challenging, just against the world itself. So the entity that attacks us for having any faith in anything at all. The other 2 areas that I typically write about, one is on kind of history and culture, and it's a big thing for me. People like to say context is king, and then that and say, but culture is queen, because your immediate literary context, like, oh, well, I've read the chapter before and the chapter after, so obviously I know what's here. Generally, you don't.
Right.
I mean, you can understand what's being said, but do you know why that conversation is taking place? Do you know what cultural factors come into play that? Do you know what geographic factors come into play? There's so much to it within the culture and the history of the scriptural time period. So that's one area. And another one is just language and word studies. Everybody studies. I've done a lot of it, and I've recently discovered a couple things. One is people rely way too much on Strong's. They think Strong's is their lexicon. But also, people tend to have this idea that a word study means I go and I find a word, and I find the way that I like where it's used, and I like what it means in that passage, and I superimpose that meaning on every other single time this word is used. That builds for some problematic understanding. It builds for some problematic theology.
Sure. So I want to go back real quick. When you first started this blog, did you get much of a response from your friends that were kind of interested in theological things, or did they kind of just shrug it off like, oh, he's still just, Messianic, whatever that is, right?
It was kind of mixed. I had a couple friends that they had known me well enough as we grew up together that I think for them, they didn't care, right? They were like, I already know what he's going to say.
Sure.
It was more of the ones that were like, okay, I've never really understood why you did that. We've never had that conversation, or I've never thought about it, or I never cared. When you're a teenager, most of your friends don't care about theology. That's just sort of the norm. But there's been a couple of them where, again, because we all grew up in the same youth group, they were Baptist, or they were really close to, at least, their family, theologically speaking. And now, either they're kind of like, halfway in and out. It's like, oh, well, I still go to church on Sunday, but I also, started going to this Sabbath group where they'll show up during the feast to learn more, and, kind of slowly coming around. So it was a bit of a mixed response. What I didn't have too much of was people arguing and trying to prove me wrong. At least, again, from my teen years. It was a lot more of like, oh, well, that's neat. Thanks for sharing.
The
Really,
seeds
the arguments
planted, though.
Do what?
The seeds kind of planted, though. It's interesting that you can see the people that are open to that idea. Of course, it's going to be a mixed bag, but and then there's that, you're just planting a thought in those people's minds that are willing to dig a little deeper and kind of question the mainstream narrative.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. A couple friends in particular, which I won't mention by name, but a couple in particular that I could see changes in them, because again, all my teenage friends are back when I was in West Tennessee. I live in East Tennessee now. I'm kind of seeing a change in them as time, like, what's going on here? And then now, so they're like, oh well, yeah, I show up every Sabbath and I don't eat these unclean things anymore, and again, kind of a mixed bag. Some of them are hesitant to actually say, take kosher for example. They'd be hesitant to say, well, it's wrong to do it. It's just, well, I know that God doesn't want me to. So we're getting there. We're getting there.
Yeah.
Right.
It's encouraging that at least some of them have responded positively
Right.
towards it, though. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's all good. I was just going to say, I think most people kind of go through that stage where they're a little bit more kind of wishy-washy about exactly the extent of what we're supposed to do. But I know, like when my family came into this movement, we kind of went through that where it's like, well, we should eat kosher, but let's eat bacon anyways. And that went on for a little while, but that was quite a while ago now. But no, I do think though that the movement as a whole, though, I do think that we have something right. I think that, and kind of going into that, I mean, you were kind of always, I think we all were when we went into it, kind of the weird kid, the outsider for doing that stuff. But I think that is actually one of the things we do have right, in that we seem to be pushing towards, maybe not quite as much as, well, I don't know, it might be kind of a toss up, but like the Mennonites and Amish, to become Mennonite or Amish, you really have to not care about what the world thinks about you. Not just the secular world, but there's a lot of condemnation coming from Christians as well. And I think that the movement, we do have that going for us. A lot of people, maybe maybe to the wrong extent, because a lot of people, I think, get caught up on the high from being, it becomes a holier than thou thing, and it ends up becoming a, let's see what all I can throw out so people think I'm even weirder, because weirdness then becomes a gauging mechanism for truth, which I don't think is healthy. But no, something else that I think also lends to this is people, once they get more comfortable being the weird person, become more comfortable with being the conspiracy theorist, which has kind of moved Messianics into this odd position of becoming almost synonymous with conspiracy theorists. Like, oh, you're a Messianic or Torah Observant, so therefore you must be a conspiracy theorist. I think you're trying to coin a term on that one right now. If you want to share that one with our audience, but
Yeah. So of course, like I said, Torah Apologetics is my serious site. You know, that's I did create a Facebook page September of last year, so we're nearing a year now. Got over 1,400, I think, over 1,400 followers on it, after losing a lot of people. But I want to do a combination of things. It's a meme page, so it's called Messianic Memes for Torah Observant Peeps. And there was kind of a twofold piece of that. One is just some party, wholesome fun, because I'm a millennial and we tend to express ourselves in memes. So that's just the way of things, especially when you want to reach people. As silly as that sounds, I mean, essentially memes are the new gospel tract, or at least it can be. It can be a method for that. So one of them is, put out some stuff that you can share on your Facebook page that you got friends and family that's like, that's kind of odd, or I've never thought about that before. And they're probably the majority, slightly more than 50% of what I share is more internal. So it's directed at people that are also Messianic, Torah Observant, Hebrew roots, whatever flavor of the day there is. But things that are critical of just what you mentioned, the craziness that we see growing so rampant. Just as much as the truth of Torah has proliferated in the last few years, mostly because of social media, so has the craziness. And so I've created, or trying to coin a term that's a portmanteau of Messianic and fringe. So I use the term FRINGIANIC. I've actually seen 2 people now on social media that have themselves used the word outside of interacting with my page. So I know it's starting to catch on.
well, it's
I'll
a
be
good one
using
to
it.
catch on.
Yeah.
I think that one can join more people's vocabularies, to be sure. But no, it's like you said, the social media and the internet, actually more like it, because YouTube as well has become a breeding ground for heresy, as it turns out. It turns out, like, I don't know if the question was ever asked, but if the question was asked, what would happen if the entire world was allowed to talk freely? The answer to that is a lot of crazy heresies would suddenly pop up. I'm almost convinced we would have half the amount of flat earthers and people rejecting Paul and whatnot, as we do if we did not have the internet. It just seems to be a good way for people who have found one point that seems really good to get it out to everyone all at once.
Right. Is like you were saying, I mean, people figure out, oh, I can do a word study. And so like you're saying, they take a word, look at it everywhere and then develop a theology based on that. And because they get this new like talent or skill or whatever, they think, I can be a teacher now. I have this new revelation that I need to share and propagate. And I think like since Messianics in particular have a kind of independent spirit and just questioning the mainstream and all that, they have that proclivity to want to be putting new things out there constantly. It's almost an addiction. Like, okay, Messianic is true, right? The Messianic movement. Okay, that means all of history and all of these religious people are wrong. So now it's normal and correct to question the mainstream. So how far can I take that? How far can I push those boundaries? Then you also have the desire for likes and shares and all that, which happens to all of us. But it just gets spread like wildfire on Messianic pages because it's something new. It's something different that we haven't heard before.
But, right.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot of, so many times, and I mean, even off the top of my head, I can think of at least a dozen different people that fit that exact example. And it's where you come into this newly and freshly, and like you said, you have this sort of idea of, oh, well, this is true, and what I was taught was wrong. Therefore, everything I was taught was wrong. I have to throw everything out.
Or at least question it.
But the problem is, they're not starting fresh on everything. They're starting with an automatic bias of, if it relates to what I've heard before, it's already wrong, which means the real truth must be not whatever I was taught before. Because the truth can't be whatever the church says.
Right.
The church must be vegan and all the other sorts of craziness. Right. But typically what tends to happen, and again, I know plenty of examples, is somebody comes into this newly, whether it's somebody that's been a Christian for 30 years and they have their eyes open to the Sabbath and they enter through that way, or somebody that hasn't been a believer in anything at all suddenly coming in, but they start learning so much and they have this zeal and this just desire, this burning desire to share that with others, which is great. The problem is they set themselves up as a teacher. They put together their blog, they create their YouTube channel, they make their Facebook lives, and they set themselves up as teachers, which is specifically against what Paul's instruction was when setting up leaders and people to come in to teach. He says, not a new convert, not somebody that just learned to do this. First, because you don't have the grounding and the time in the faith itself. You don't have the maturity. And this enters into what you're probably familiar with, what is usually the Reformed term of the cage stage, right? The Calvinist that's newly Calvinist that wants to make everybody else Calvinist, and so he just kind of goes crazy and like, well, you just lock them up for a bit. I call it the cage stage because you have this burning desire, like I said, to share what you've learned with everybody, and you have this desire to consume all information that you can find, every teaching, not evangelical, whatever is not Protestant in general, what I've already been taught, give me everything. And you can find a teaching for everything. You can find your flat earth. You can find your
sacred name.
Your sacred name or stuff, your God stole seed from Joseph and put it inside Mary, and that's how Yeshua was conceived. There's any sort of thing you can possibly think of, and many you can't. I'm surprised at the creativity of some of these people.
Right.
But that's what you'll come across. And they build themselves up with this wall of a confirmation bias is really what it is. And get so woke that you enter a new realm of cognitive dissonance. You can no longer be objective because you've already decided that every single thing related to what I already was taught must be wrong.
Right. Yeah. And I think it sets it up for there's not as much discipleship going on right now as there is just a bunch of pontificating. People prefer to pontificate over actually discipling. They'd prefer use a bunch of words and just basically go on rants rather than actually disciple. And we think we've actually talked about this a little bit before. This ends up in stuff like if you ask someone to describe the Trinity, and this is not just an issue that exists within Messianics, but but we really, really should, as a Messianic movement, this is one thing we should really be correcting. This should be part of what sets us apart, to be honest. But if you ask any random Messianic to describe the Trinity, because most of the time they're rejecting it, and that's why you're asking the question, they end up articulating modalism, which is a heresy that was rejected by the early church. And so it's like a lot of these people, and I think that I can say this as a broad statement and still be safe. I think this applies to a lot of other things. A lot of people are rejecting things, but they don't even know what they're rejecting. That, like, this person that's rejecting the Trinity is actually rejecting modalism, and you have to teach them about the Trinity in order for them to reject that, in order to even, move forward and try to in any way debate them. But I think a lot of things, like, you posted that I saw you posted something like, what was that, 29 proofs for the flat earth or something? Wasn't that you who posted that? Yeah, and like some of those are like legitimate things that I've seen circulating in Messianic groups and stuff, Facebook groups and whatnot. And some of the arguments are just absolutely absurd. Like, why do helicopters, why can they stay flying in the same spot for 2 hours and stuff like that? So, like, you don't even understand what you're arguing against here. So I think kind of what I'm getting at here is, as a movement, one of the main critiques I'm going to put forward here is we need to actually start discipling again and actually starting to teach doctrine. A lot of Messianics I've met too aren't too big of a fan of that. They're like, well, theology ruins your relationship with God or whatever. But the funny thing is, if you ask them to share about their faith, they'll usually give you a theological stance. Because if they're not giving you a theological stance, then honestly, they're probably in a bit of trouble there. But
on the same plane as discipleship is the issue of fellowship in general. What you tend to have is people that have a fellowship community, and I don't mean you have a group to meet with. Right? There's a distinct difference between, I attend such and such congregation, or I go to such and such, Messianic synagogue or Messianic fellowship or whatever, versus actually I'm part of a community. And this is something that the group that I meet with locally that we're working on doing right now is establishing a faith community. Not just a, hey, let's get together on Shabbat and watch a DVD, or one of us teaches, or whatever, but specifically let's build a community. Let's establish something that we're a part of, not just that we take part of, right? So it's actually we and our families are part of the community itself. Because when you don't have that, it's almost like family. Disagreeing with a stranger in line at Walmart, that's really easy. You walk away and you never have to care again. But when you disagree with a sibling, or aunt, uncle, niece, nephew, parent, you can't just walk away and never talk to them again, right? I mean, I understand you can. But in general, you kind of got to resolve that. Same thing within issues within the faith, because we are called brethren, right? That's the term that's used for fellow believers for a reason. But generally, people attend a fellowship, and then they reach that theological difference. They reach that issue of, oh, well, you have the wrong calendar, and you refuse to listen. You say the wrong name. Again, insert issue here. And they leave. And they go somewhere else, and they meet somewhere else, and they start doing the same thing over there. And inevitably, it splits every year or two, because something like that comes up again, because people aren't devoted, first of all, to being part of a community, and second of all, being, like you said, relational, which is discipleship itself. And so many people are informed theologically not by their local fellowship and the leaders that they willingly submit to in their local community, but instead they're informed by people they don't actually know on social media. And it makes it a lot easier to pontificate about all of your deep theological knowledge and how you can prove wrong every globetard and Catholic and all those other sorts of things on the internet. But what are you actually doing? What are you actually accomplishing to the kingdom?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, fellowship issue is I would say probably the biggest issue, the, combating that independent spirit, because it does take a little bit of an independent spirit to even move into the Messianic movement, because obviously you're rejecting a fairly mainstream position and questioning that. But at the same time, it's like a teenager where, teenagers don't want anything to do with the family, but at the same time, you're in like the formative ages of your life where you need to be the most like discipled by your parents, and get rooted in reality. Um, or think about all these kids that go off to college and they learn all these new things, and it's like that, where you don't want to be a part of the fellowship because you're this independent pioneer spirit, but at the same time it's absolutely the most necessary thing for you, or you'll get drawn away by one of these insane heresies, or just basically be fruitless because you're completely isolated. But
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, I mean, from personal experience, and this also isn't just in the Messianic realm, but it seems to be especially bad among Torah observant Christians and Messianics and whatnot. Probably at least 50%, I can say safely. I'd say like 90% of all church splits really weren't worth splitting over. There should have never been a split in the first place. And to be honest, I think that we are worse off for it, which kind of strikes upon another core issue within the movement, and that is accountability. A lot of people don't want accountability. They don't want personal accountability. They don't want theological accountability. They don't want spiritual accountability, which is different. I would say, because spiritual accountability is making sure someone is up. I think it was Spurgeon that said something like, I can know every multi-syllabic word in the dictionary and whatnot, but if I don't have love, and that's the difference there. I'm kind of rabbit trailing here, but I think it's an important rabbit trail. I can be as theologically minded as any other theologian, but if I'm not in my scripture, if I'm not praying, that's spiritual accountability. Somebody making sure you're doing those things and not getting hung up on the theology. But we do need all three of those things in the movement, and I think that's what these splits are really about. Is people don't want the theological accountability in particular. They do not want to stay and talk it out and figure out um, any sort of compromise, or even admit that they're wrong. That's the big one. A lot of people are right until they have personal revelation from God, which yeah, and then finally, they were wrong, and now they're right again, though. And that's what's important. But yeah, definitely something I think the movement needs to work on.
and really that's the fruits of the spirit: being humble, humility, and being patient, and sadly that is lacking in the Messianic community. But anyway.
It's maturity in general.
Right.
And part of it is because it is relatively young. We've had a few kind of what you could essentially call Torah-based awakenings over the last 140 years or so. In the late 1800s, you had your various groups that were Sabbath keeping. That was kind of the starting point. You had your Seventh-day Baptists, you had your Seventh-day Adventists, late 1800s or so, that had their own theological baggage, but they started to get back on track. What I would say is back on track, as far as that goes. And then in I believe it was 30s, is when Herbert Armstrong left the Seventh-day Baptist he'd been meeting with and started the Radio Church of God that then became the Worldwide Church of God. And that pretty much reigned supreme. If you were a Sabbath-keeping, kosher-eating, feast-keeping believer that still called yourself a Christian, not converted to Judaism, but you still called yourself a Christian, and you fit into that camp prior to about 1980, you were Worldwide or one of its offshoots. That was pretty much it. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of people, lots of people, literally worldwide. They were across the globe. But that was pretty much the only option. And then in the 80s, you had your introduction of Jews for Jesus, and outreach to Judaism that then got people interested in Jewish roots, Hebrew roots, that sort of thing. And that's what reached a lot of people and touched a lot of people to bring everybody in. But even that, I mean, even if you said it was 1980, that's only 40 years ago. And so relatively young as far as a faith reform, sort of movement goes. And really, we stunted in terms of growth. I mean, as much as we, as a movement, as a faith, have grown, I think there's been a lot of that. There have been leaps and bounds. And even what I would say, I usually use the word normative Christian church because I don't like to say that Messianics aren't Christians. I think that's being disingenuous. Even though a lot of people that call them Messianics are adamant they are not Christians. And I'm like, yeah, but you're kind of not Messianic either. I guess. But I mean, words mean things. Terminology is important. But I usually use the term normative Christian church when I'm referring to what we would just say is Protestant Christianity as a differentiating factor versus Messianic. So I don't say that Messianic isn't Christian, but it's not your typical evangelical. It's not your typical Protestant. Certainly not your typical Catholic or Orthodox. But it is relatively young, and it is stuck in that. It is essentially a teenager, which is funny that you mentioned, being that sort of teenager where now you really need that. You really, you have this formative time. We have some scholarship, right? We have some Messianic scholars now that are actually kind of being accepted by either the normative Christianity, or you have regular normative Christian scholars that are starting to be more pro-law. You've got Craig Keener, who's a very well-known Christian scholar who's keeping the Sabbath. You've got Dr. Carmen Imes, currently a professor who's telling people that Sinai matters and we should be studying the law and it's important to us and we need to understand how it applies to us. Things like that. Not quite there yet, to use a simple term.
Right.
But it's very encouraging to see things like that. One of my favorites is Michael Heiser, right? Dr. Heiser.
Right.
And he does the Naked Bible podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And I listen to it pretty much every week when he has a new episode. And not because I want him to teach me all things, but because if nothing else, even when I reach the end of it and I say I still don't agree with his position, even if nothing else, is he does a pretty good job of presenting information, and he's really good at introducing you to new information. He had an episode. I basically binge listened to the whole series, so I can't even really tell you when it was. I know when I listened to it. I think it's about a year or so old now. But he had an episode on Paul's usage of, really Paul's quote of the prophets. And he says, all Israel will be saved. What does he mean by Israel? And Heiser's conclusion at the end is Israel, based on Pauline theology, being that, if you are belonging to Messiah, you are an heir of Abraham. You are a co-heir, the seed of Abraham. Then Paul's usage of all Israel encompasses believers. That's not to say the church replaced Israel, because he's very careful to say this is not replacement theology. Rather, to Paul, if you are a believer in Messiah Yeshua, you were considered a member of the Commonwealth of Israel. So to hear Dr. Heiser say, all believers, yes, you are Israel. That's a big deal. To hear Carmen Imes say, the law matters and you should still be studying it. That's a big deal. Craig Keener saying, yeah, I keep the Sabbath, and I think everybody should. That's a big deal. These are things that have only happened really just within the last few years. And we have more people now that have been Messianic for years that are getting more into academia as well. Ryan White holds a master's, I think, in biblical studies. Matt Napier is currently working on his PhD in biblical studies. So I have aspirations of going to grad school maybe next year for the same. But it's growing and it's gaining acceptance. And that's one way of evangelizing, and it's not the fun way that everybody wants to talk about, but it's one way of evangelizing is actually to address these theological concerns from a scholarly perspective, where you don't sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist saying it's all pagan because the pagans put it into the church in the 2nd century, even before the Catholic Church existed, but somehow Catholics started in the 2nd century, whatever. But everything is pagan, and go read my blog, and make sure you tune into my Facebook Live.
Right.
That doesn't work for most people. most people don't come to the truth through that. And I have an ethical and moral issue with the idea of, oh, well, even if you don't have everything right, you're ultimately, you're leading people closer to God anyways. Well, do I then sin that, grace over that other person may abound? I think it kind of relates the same. I think it was even John Wesley that I'm paraphrasing now, but it's basically like, I will do anything except sin to bring someone to knowledge of God. So why are we okay with doctrine being like, oh, you know what? Yeah, I guess there really is a Trinity, or there really isn't a Trinity, or whatever. As you mentioned with most Messianics, you articulate the Trinity and you're actually talking about modalism. At least most oneness Pentecostals, when their theologians go and they debate and argue against the Trinity, at least they understand it. At least it's not a straw man. It's not arguing against something that the other person is not even saying. You can come to a coherent argument on something, but it's not as fun, it's not as easy, and it's not as easy to do with Google and YouTube in 30 minutes before I sit down and write a blog.
Right.
I have to read a paper book.
Sometimes I think that's how most books are written by some of these people. They just sit down and they just write out their rant, and somehow it sells. Full of fallacy and all. But no, I agree. A lot of it seems like a lot of scholars are making this move toward. There's still a minority, and they're a minority in biblical scholarship that people who believe that the Bible is authoritative and whatnot. But of those people, there seems to be a movement toward it. Heiser is definitely one of my favorites. I disagree with him fervently on some stuff, without a doubt. But he is definitely one of the people who I can say has helped shape my theology the most. And I've been thinking, I didn't even know he had said that, but even before you telling me that, I've always thought he's kind of just right there on the edge of becoming a Messianic. James White is kind of along the same lines. I know, but I mean, he's a theonomist, and I don't see how he can stay a consistent theonomist for very long without becoming Messianic. So I guess we'll see how that goes. But yeah, and I do agree. I think that one of the main things we can do is actually start developing our theology more, because that's the first step toward actually maybe starting a more legitimate Messianic conference, which would be, I think, a very good step in the grand scheme of things. It doesn't have to be too very organized, but some organization, some large overarching organization would really help. I think for our own safety, it would be better if it was a little more strict, because if we look at history shows that the conferences that have not maintained strictness have ended up falling away much faster. I mean, look at the Methodist Church, any liturgical church, the Anglicans, the Lutherans. They started saying, well, that's okay. You can have separate beliefs from what we hold to as a denomination, to the teachers, which to some level I get. But when you look at like the Southern Baptist Conference and whatnot, one of the things that I think has helped them to stay as strong as they have for this long as a conference is the fact that they have historically not tolerated too much until very recently. They started tolerating some people who are very teach some very heretical stuff within their conference, but historically they've not put up with too much. And I mean, I'm only saying all this because please steal my idea. I don't care. I don't need any credit for it. I think that the main thing we need to do at this point is try to improve the movement as a whole, because otherwise what we're going to see is just a lot more of the same stuff, a lot more of Bob over here deciding that the Pauline epistles, who needs those? I mean, like they're not that fun, to be honest, if you think about them. Paul just says you shouldn't do a bunch of stuff. Not very fun. But No, and if we had a conference, that would be publicly condemned, and a large statement, which would reach a lot more people, would have probably been issued. I mean, that happened recently. You've probably watched our series. If you're watching this video, you've probably watched at least one of the videos in our previous series on just and best of the Christian truthers rejecting the Pauline epistles and First Peter and Acts and Luke, and who knows what else. But no, that would have been publicly condemned on a much larger scale. John and I are just two I mean, as far as the internet goes, we're just two random guys kind of talking, hoping someone will listen. But a conference would have done a lot more, I think, to maybe help keep some people out of that. Because if you look at the video, just as many people who have thumbs downed it, twice as many have given it a thumbs up. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of weird because we're working in reverse, where these denominations started as kind of a unit, whereas we're trying to bring a bunch of isolated people. And it's weird because, like, when you come into this movement, you're like, oh, these people that just kind of are led by the Spirit, study the Word, keep Sabbath, okay. And they realize there's something beyond just me and my family doing this, and so that's as a move of the Spirit all over the world, bringing that into a cohesive conference, or even just having like a consistent creed among them would be great. But it's like, how do you do that? I don't know. Maybe you have some thoughts.
Yeah, and it's funny that you bridged that now. Earlier this year, maybe around February or so, I was having a conversation, and really a series of conversations, with a friend of mine that I fellowship with, and he and I have the exact same complaints. And like I said before, I live in Chattanooga, which is the Messianic Mecca. Everybody, I can personally name probably at least 6 different families that, and we're not talking a couple, we're talking a couple and anywhere from 4 to 8 kids that didn't even live anywhere near the area of Chattanooga, didn't live in the state, and they have moved here, relocated here, because there are so many Torah-keeping fellowships, whether they moved to be part of a specific one or just because there are so many believers here. But it's also a perfect example of the sort of sad state that we're talking about, when in this area we've got, if I was to sum everybody, probably close to 500 people, at least the ones that I know of, within 30 to 45 minutes of Chattanooga. You got close to 500 people. Then why do we have 15 different groups, 25 different groups? When the core of what we believe and why we do what we do is all the same. It's different calendars, it's different ways to pronounce names, it's different conceptions of what a triune God is or a biune God. A lot of Messianics tend to hold to a Armstrongist, worldwide Godhead theology, which is essentially binitarian, right? They remove the personhood of the Spirit because God is a person, the Son is a person, they're both God, but the Spirit's just sort of this sharedness between the two. It's not its own thing.
Goes
so
out
binitarian.
from.
Do what?
Goes out from.
Yeah. The binitarian, Trinitarian, oneness, Unitarian, all sorts of different things. But this friend and I were discussing it, and we have multiple times this year, to the extent that I actually started trying to think up a name of what we would call this organization, whether it's the Union of Messianic Fellowships or whatever we're going to call it. Within Messianic Judaism, they're all a union, right? The UMJA and the UMJC and the MJAA and IAMCS and all this. But at least they have that. This sort of independent, that's usually when I say Messianic, is I clarify Messianic Judaism, which is actually a structured organization. It's mostly kind of a charismatic Christian thing with a lot of Jewish tradition. So you have that. And then independent Messianic. And independent very much so because there is no accountability. And this is some of the stuff that we've talked about. I can go on and name a whole bunch of people that, and of course you already mentioned Justin Best being one of them, that sets themselves up as a teacher, they gain this huge following, they inform so many people, and because people see them teaching, they assume, well, you are a God-given, you are a God-appointed teacher, the God-given calling of being a teacher, so therefore I'm going to listen. Just by default, if somebody is teaching, people treat them like a teacher. And that has caused much harm. I mean, I've seen individual people's faith walks destroyed, individual lives destroyed, marriages, families broken up because of bad teaching, because of terrible leadership. You get a congregational leader that's telling someone they need to divorce their spouse because of theological disagreements. Not because of marital issues, but because of theological disagreements. Just horrible things. And if you had that sort of umbrella, that sort of covering organization, that structure, then you could have that sent in. When you have a big fellowship, and this is one of the things that we're trying to avoid doing by setting up our own fellowship community, is you have a fellowship that's based around a certain teacher. And you can pick really any of the big name teachers, but it really becomes more of a cult of personality about them. And if that person ever stepped down, or if they ever left, or they stopped teaching or whatever, the whole fellowship is going to fall apart. Whereas if you had a church like you mentioned, the SBC, if you have a Baptist church with 300 people and the pastor steps down or gets asked to leave or whatever, what's going to happen is the Baptist convention is going to send a new pastor, right? I mean, they will appoint someone new. The church, the community, the fellowship stays together. It's just the teacher's different. But so many times if the teacher leaves, they take 80% of the fellowship with them and the rest are just kind of left to do whatever, or they split down the middle, or and it happens over and over and over again. And so to remedy that, what I've been talking about doing, as I mentioned, at least for most of this year, is trying to, first of all, it's kind of forge alliances with solid teachers. People that have been doing this a while, people that are well informed, that aren't just given to every wind of doctrine, people that don't have a really rocky history where 15 years ago they denied Yeshua, and then 5 years after that they said, well, he's real, but he's not divine. And then a few years after that they said, well, I'm just going to walk away from ministry. And then a few years after that, changed theirs again. Your opinions should evolve. Your beliefs will change over time as you learn more, and you should be willing to question what you previously learned and take in new information. But you shouldn't have the most core foundational tenets of your faith changing every couple of years. You shouldn't have that foundation being torn apart.
Especially not publicly like that. I mean, I think one of the things that kind of sets appointed teachers apart is you have to, it's kind of a learned thing on how to question your theology and redevelop your theology without airing it publicly and making it one of those flip-flop things. There's a particular teacher that that I can think of that did that down in Tennessee, and he liked to say a few things one year and then he would completely contradict himself like the next year, which might be who you're talking about. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, it's like if you are questioning that, and that's one of the things that I think that's part of why we need to organize, because one of the things that like the Southern Baptist Convention or any other number of conventions, I hate to just pick one and use it, but it is what it is. I mean, like if you're having trouble as a teacher with any doctrine, you can bring it before a council of other teachers and they'll help you to figure that out. If you're lone wolfing it, that doesn't happen because you're not submitting yourself for accountability to anyone.
Yes, and that's one of the biggest issues. If I was going to enumerate or pinpoint, I think are the biggest issues that we're facing in the faith, in the movement as a whole, it is just that. And it leads to, well, is related to at least, a lack of ecumenism, right? This idea that, well, we have different calendars, so we can't fellowship together. Well, I pronounce the divine name this way, you pronounce it that way, and this guy over here, well, he refuses to try to pronounce it at all, so we can't fellowship together. These are not reasons that you shouldn't be able to fellowship with people. These are not reasons that you should put someone out of fellowship. These are not hills to die on, so to speak. But I think, at least what I have in mind, an approach to take is to start with people that are already established leaders. Because if you look at, you start with Moses, when Moses appointed leaders of Israel, he told the people to pick, you loud there. He told people to select elders from their own tribes. You appointed an elder over your tribe that was chosen from your tribe. But Moses didn't just say, okay, I like you, and I like you, and I like you, and you guys are in charge now. Moses didn't just say, okay, everybody just do whatever I say. Right? So it's the people themselves from within their own community. They started, and it was essentially from the ground up. So your leaders started here and were appointed by their own people. Paul uses the same model when he's talking to Timothy, and going in, because he sent Timothy out to help build up these assemblies, these congregations, these communities, help them set up their own leaders. He gave them qualifications for leaders. But it wasn't for Timothy to go in and say, I like you and you and you. It was for him to go in and teach them how to do it themselves. And that's the point. So my idea is to kind of take from that and take people that are already established leaders, that are well-learned, that haven't just recently found, oh, well, I'm new to Torah, and I've been doing this about 3.5 months, and, I'm ready to lead. No, you're not. 3.5 years, you're not ready to lead. There's just too much. Same thing. You wouldn't elect a president that's 14 years old, even if he's really, really smart. He could have 180 IQ, but you wouldn't elect a president that's 14. Why? He's not mature. Even if he knows all kinds of stuff, he's not mature. And there's a difference there. So we need established leaders. We need people that are intelligent, that are learned. I would say scholarly. And when I say scholarly, it doesn't mean if you don't hold a PhD in language, then you don't qualify. To me, scholarly, whether you went to university, seminary, Bible college or anything or not, do you commit yourself to studying, not just confirming what you've already chosen to believe? Dig in and find an answer. Are you actually looking to communicate the information accurately and in accordance with biblical truth? So finding people that are leaders, finding people that are, I would say, solid scholars, getting them together and working out, kind of hashing out a plan of, okay, how do we act together in unity and establish some rules where then we could go to fellowships and congregations and say, hey, it's almost like take the UMJA, for example, it's the Union of Messianic Jewish Assemblies, I think. Take that for an example, and you charter your congregation with them. And they have things like a Beit Din, which would be that council of elders that you would call if somebody, if you have a teacher that comes in and starts teaching something crazy, you call them up and be like, hey, the teacher last week, he told us that, Paul should be ripped out of our Bibles. Okay, well, we're going to call a meeting, and these leaders, these established, well-known elders, leaders, and teachers will get together with this person and say, hey, is this what you're teaching? Because not only is it unorthodox, but it's also unbiblical. And hash that out. You'd have an organization that would essentially appoint ordained leaders. And that's something that's also greatly overlooked is ordination. As it stands right now, most Messianic teacher, pastor, rabbi, shepherd, whatever they want to call themselves, they can't even legally marry people in their congregations. They can't even legally oversee funerals because they're not ordained. And I understand the argument of being like, well, that's being recognized by the state and it's a religious thing, not a government thing or whatever. But you can't get in prisons, you can't marry, you can't bury, you can't, do a lot of things because people don't care. So having a body that would say, okay, well, we will ordain you. You will be officially an ordained minister under, like I said, Union and Messianic fellowships, whatever. But here's kind of the core doctrinal statement. And, we would also come together and support these individual fellowships, support these congregations. And once you start networking groups together, then you have something of not just, well, this is where I attend because this is where I happen to be located, but you have real fellowship. You have, cross-continental, interstate fellowships between people. You can network together. You can start having conferences during the year where you have hundreds of people that gather together to listen to these teachers, that listen to people that they would otherwise be attending their fellowship. It just happens to be in a different place. It's not all based on one person and one person's personality to where as I said, if that teacher ever stops teaching, the whole fellowship just falls apart.
That's
Right.
good because it's like an organic kind of structure to it where you're not saying, okay, there's this one group and like everybody's under that and whatever they say doctrinally, like we have to follow. Because I mean, we used to be a part of MIA and then they went off on their own thing. And of course, we had to split away from them. It's like, well, how do you prevent that from happening if you do create a structure? But if you're establishing these proven, mature believers, like you're saying, that have already proved that they are qualified elders and leaders, and kind of bring them together to at least agree we need leadership, then you have something there. I mean, without even calling it anything, you have something, you have networking. But anyway,
Right.
Alex.
Right. No, I was basically going to say what you just said.
Oh.
And like I said, I mean, you can come together on the fundamentals. I would never expect everyone to agree on everything, especially in this, just because people do look into it way more. And that's probably the most positive thing that you can say about the Messianic movement is it has encouraged people to read and study the Bible more than anything. Because generally, if you're just at your local Baptist church, you'll have your weekly Bible study, which means Beth Moore or John MacArthur, or depending on what flavor you have. But you have somebody else's work. You're reading somebody else's teaching, and you're reading the Bible filtered through their lens. And that's kind of the bulk of it. Or maybe you do a plan where you read through the whole Bible in a year. But most normative Christians, they don't study the Bible as intensely as Messianic people do. And that's usually what leads people to being, quote, Messianic, is because of that drive to study your Bible, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
And I would never say that, well, that's the problem here. No, and that's I think that the most positive thing is that it really drives people to read the Word.
Right.
What I would like to see is just, okay, well, we can all agree that we should be doing that. Let's just take these core fundamental things and put together essentially a core doctrinal statement or a core statement of faith. Enumerate it within, say a dozen bullet points of what we would say is true biblical Messianic orthodoxy. Things like Yeshua wasn't just a man, right? He wasn't just some guy. Well, he was sinful until God adopted him at his baptism. But before that, he was just a normal guy that sinned. That's theologically problematic. That is the sort of thing that cannot be tolerated because we're no longer talking about the same Messiah.
Right.
Names, your individual fellowship, and even individual people in it, you can use whatever name you want. You cannot use any name you want. And you can call him Jesus, Yeshua, and any, whatever crazy flavor of the day, and anything in between. But these core doctrinal things within this statement, you would come together on that. And say, okay, with this is what we consider, like, you accept these, and we bring you in under the umbrella. You're a fellow member congregation. We can all agree to see each other as brothers, not see each other as heretics, not see each other as people that don't have the name right, so they're going to hell, or whatever. Outside of that, you have your autonomy. You have your freedom to believe all manner of these other sorts of things. But we maintain the line well enough. We toe the line enough on the most important fundamental things, the things that are foundational to the faith, that, at least in my opinion, if you throw them out, you are actually abandoning the faith entirely. Like I said, you make Yeshua nothing more than just a guy. He's just a man. He sinned until he was about 30 or whatever. That's not even the same faith anymore.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, going back to what you were saying, it's the movement's got people in their Bibles. Yeah. I remember a friend recounting one time when he was at a large gathering. It was in Indiana, and evidently I didn't know this, but Indiana as a state gathers together once a month. All of the congregations get together, which is pretty cool. Honestly, I think that might be a cool place to start for as far as fellowship goes. But he recounts one time when they were talking and they were reading through some passage, and he was like, well, it was pointing out to me that that such and such event actually didn't happen. and like the room fell silent. And then he's like, and then you hear people, the pages in their Bible flipping as like for, he said like 5 minutes of everybody just flipping through, reading it and then going, yeah, you're right. It doesn't actually say that happened. And yeah, I mean, like the only other place you're going to find that really is in the more currently the larger reformed movement, which I'm still surprised. And actually, I know a guy who says there is a lot of people coming out of that right now into Messianic stuff. But there's some definite similarities there. But yeah, it is nice to be in a movement where you would hear those pages flipping inside of a any given room if any question is raised. Just not something you go to. I guarantee if you go to your local Mick church or your fast food gospel place, you're not going to hear that. If you raise that, people will be like, huh, well, I don't really care if it does or not. So let's move on with things and get back to the concert. But yeah, are there any other subjects you'd like to cover before we start wrapping things up? Any particular? Yeah.
I think that pretty much covers it for this. If I was gonna summarize, kind of just briefly what, in my view, and again, I've crossed spans on so many different types of groups. Those that are Messianic synagogues, those that are independent Messianic, those that are Hebrew roots, those that are former worldwide, those that are they only call themselves sacred name, all different types, and everything. So I've seen a lot of different. Not much surprises me anymore. I'll put it that way. Unless you're, well, there are things every now and then, but not much surprises me anymore. So in summary, I think the major criticisms that I have is just everything is a hill to die on. Every reason is to say that, oh, well, you just believe a lie, and everything is a conspiracy. It's the ability to be able to about. It is an acceptance of things that aren't just. I guess we see things differently. That was things that surprised me with Justin's video about Pauline epistles. So many people were like, well, no, I mean, I don't agree with him, but it's just the way he sees it. It's not that big a deal. It is a big deal. It is a big deal because as you start dismantling the Word of God, you start creating, which mind you, he didn't just remove things, he also adds things in, right? Between Enoch and Jubilees, other books. So by the time you cut and paste your own canon, you've created your own Word of God. And if you've created your own Word of God, you are creating your own God. You're making one in your own image. You're no longer sticking with the God of the Bible. The same scriptures that I would say we've used since the beginning, but you're no longer doing that. So no, that's not an issue that we can just say, well, I understand why he does it. I don't agree with him, but I get it. It's not that big a deal. It is a very big deal. Like I said, you cross certain boundaries and you're not in the same faith anymore. So we have oftentimes an unwillingness to be able to disagree, except on really, really important things, and it's, well, we can just see that different. And the conspiracies. And then on the positive side is, like I said, more than anything, is this drive to study Scripture. 119 really popularized test everything. I like that. I have other disagreements with 119 Ministries on things, but I love the whole model of we don't just believe it because we've been taught it, but if somebody makes a statement or if it is a doctrine that's being held or whatever, we test it. And you should. You should. Paul tells you to. He praised the Bereans for doing just that, so you should. So this idea we're going to check the Scripture for ourselves, this fervent desire to not only try to be biblically correct, but to share that with others. Like I said, the zeal is a good thing. The heart for the Torah is a good thing. The desire to, well, one of the things, I'm an administrator in a Facebook group that has, I think we've got over 6,000 members now, a Messianic group. And one of the most common members is always, is this considered breaking the Sabbath? Is this unkosher? Is this, this, or what happens about this? Or do I have to do that? Or I had a Jewish friend that told me about this. Is that, do I have to do it, or whatever? Is that desire to be correct, to worship the Father the way He intended us to worship Him. So those things are, again, I think are the upside. I think those are the biggest positives that we've got. And it's not even that we're off base and living unbiblically and whatever. I think in general, the Messianic movement has a great understanding of what the intent of Scripture is. It's not just, I believe in Jesus, I'll go to heaven when I die. I mean, the intent of Scripture is not so casual. It should be ingrained in your everyday life. We recite the Shema, and part of the Shema and the Ve'ah is that you recite these words, right, every day. You get up and you lie down, and whether that's hyperbole, but the point is, you know it very well, and you are reading all the time, you are reciting it, you are praying it. Messianics do that very, very well. So I don't want the goodness to be overshadowed by the criticism, but I think oftentimes the criticism doesn't get voiced enough. And I know that there's a lot of people that have the same complaints, because mostly through my meme page, where I kind of make fun of some of this from time to time, I get a lot of people that say, this is really funny, but it's also kind of painful because this happened exactly in my fellowship last week. I had somebody recently that told me that they were told to leave their fellowship over flat earth stuff, because the fellowship as a whole decided, oh, well, our teacher started teaching flat earth, so we believe the earth is flat. And this person was like, well, I don't believe that. I said, well, you're just not believing what the Bible clearly describes as the creation of the world. And if you have a problem with that, then you don't believe the Bible. This isn't the place for you. That's crazy. It's absolutely crazy.
Right.
I fellowship with people that are young earth creationists, and I fellowship with people that are old earth creationists, and I fellowship with evolutionary creationists. Because everyone would agree, yes, God made everything. We all agree with God made everything. It's the methodology that people would disagree on. That's not the sort of thing to split apart, in my opinion. I think there are some things that are a level of doctrinal orthodoxy that you have to maintain. I think many things are not. So.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And in closing, please, for the sake of all of us, stop reclaiming Gnosticism as if it is some device that should be used for theological purity. You may want to study Gnosticism and see how much of it is existing currently in Messianic circles. I guarantee you can log on to any one of those Messianic Facebook groups, and see a fair bit of it. But no, I do agree. There is a reason why I am part of the movement, why I am purposely interjecting myself into it to hopefully edify another believer. I think it has plenty of redeeming qualities. Its positives far outweigh its negatives, and just because we struggle with some stuff doesn't mean that we don't have potential as a movement. And I think that's what we really need to hone in on, is being more self-critical without becoming depressing and all of that, and really start fixing some of these issues.
I may interject one thing while I'm thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
That I want to dive into at a different time. You mentioned Gnosticism. I see a lot of Gnosticism, but I also see a lot of Sadduceanism. And there's a lot of people that are unknowingly, and I posted this on Facebook maybe a couple months ago, I see a lot of people on social media that are unknowingly Sadducees. And what I mean by that is specifically this idea of Torah is scripture, but nothing else is the same. It's this idea of, oh, well, Isaiah might say something, sure. It has no weight, it has no authority unless it comes from Genesis through Deuteronomy. Or Paul says something, but Paul, he was just a guy, it was just his opinion. So unless the Torah says it, it's not really a command. It's a Sadducean belief that Torah held authority and nothing else. Everything else had to be filtered through it. And I get it, and I understand that. I don't disagree that Torah is our authority. But the point that I contend, as much as Messianics would argue, against Thomas Aquinas kind of articulated the tripartite divisions of the law, civil law versus ceremonial law versus moral law, which is very commonly used in theological circles to explain why this commandment but not that one. But at the same time, Messianics do that with, well, why don't you do this thing over here when Nehemiah says to do this on the Sabbath, to close the gates, to not buy and sell? And the Torah doesn't say you can't buy and sell. Well, no, it doesn't. It says don't work. But Nehemiah says don't buy and sell. Well, but Nehemiah is not Torah. Okay, so God working through Nehemiah wasn't as good as God working through Moses, or God in Yeshua saying this thing as a command isn't the same as God speaking it to Moses, or God through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit through Paul's teaching. Well, but it's not the same as, is it God's word or not? And not just is it because you were taught it is. I think that's one of the biggest things that people miss, is an actual historical understanding of why we have the Bible we have. The 66-book canon, well, you just said that because the Catholics gave you a 66-book canon. Catholics have your canon. So you can't claim that Catholics gave me that canon, but most people make that claim, just like with the whole Trinity thing, which again, believe it or not, but the point is you don't actually understand and know the history of what it is that you're criticizing. So there's a lot of Sadduceanism. There's a lot of this idea of, well, if Torah itself, through Deuteronomy, does not explicitly say it, then it's just not a law. I don't have to do it.
And Yeshua even said, it's something like, it says in your law, and then he went on to quote David or something to that nature.
It says, yeah, and I've used that as an example in addressing this sort of logic before, he says, as it is written in your law, and then he quotes Psalms. Yeah. Okay, well, that's not the law as we would understand it, right? And then Paul says, as it is written in the law, and then he quotes Isaiah. So according to the writers of the New Testament, Psalms is law, is Torah, right? And prophets are law, they're Torah. So maybe the whole point is it's God's inspired instruction. God's instruction via Moses should be no different and have no more or less bearing on our lives than God's instruction through Isaiah or God's instruction through John.
Good word. All right. We're probably out of time, right, Alex?
Right. Yeah, we should definitely go ahead and wrap this one up. But no, it's been very good to have you on here, and you can check him out at Torah apologetics.com. Is it .com? Okay. And I believe you also have a Facebook page for that, right? Or am I? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then definitely check out the Messianic meme page. I'm a big fan of it, as are many other people. Maybe a little too big of a fan. My millennial colors may be showing a bit there. But no, definitely go and check it out. And you have any closing thoughts, John's, either of you? Good. Okay. All right. Right. Yeah. All right. Well, we will see you next time. And hopefully this is the start of a series. I don't know if we'll be hanging it every week. My schedule's been a little bit crazy lately, so we'll see how it goes. But no, please tune in next time, and we will see you then.
Hello.